Good morning, everybody. It's Jeff Goldberg for the Sales Pro Network. It is Friday, April 23rd at 10 a.m. Eastern. If you're joining us for the first time, I'm a sales coach and trainer. I work with both individuals and organizations internationally to help them do one thing and one thing only: increase their sales. And I founded the Sales Pro Network to elevate the profession of sales, to give salespeople a place to hang out and network with each other, and to learn and to earn. And if you've joined us before, you know that every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, I either do a live training or bring you someone who can add value to the profession of sales. And today is no exception, my friends. Before I introduce today's guests, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we're at the end of May. That means we're almost 5 months into the year. And if you aren't almost 50% of the way to achieving your quota, right now is the time to get some help. Speak to your manager, hire a coach, read a book, go to a seminar, watch a YouTube video, but do something, because you don't want to get to the end of the year. You don't want to get to November and go, oh my God, I'm not going to hit my quota. What do I do? It's too late at that point. So take action now. And the other thing I don't want to sound like a broken record about, but I'm going to say it anyways, is please pay no attention to the madness that's going on around you. There's chaos in the economy. There's chaos in politics. I can't tell you strongly enough, leave that stuff alone. Your prospects are waiting for you to get in touch with them and share what you have to offer with them. They still need what you've got. So don't worry about the economy. Don't worry about politics. Just go do your job. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest. He's a negotiation trainer and consultant. He's the author of In the Lead, Mastering Sales Negotiations. Please welcome Saad Saad. Good morning, Saad.
Jeff, good morning.
Good to see you, my friend. Hey, before I get started with the 1,000,001 negotiating questions I have for you, because I think all salespeople are interested in learning how to be more masterful negotiators, can you give us maybe the 2 to 3 minute version of your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Professional background, how I got into negotiation. Which direction you want me to take this in, Jeff?
Well, whatever you want to tell us about your life up until now in 2 or 3 minutes.
All right. No
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. There's one more thing I do have to say. We're trying something new today. This is a new thing on StreamYard. If you make comments, if you're watching us live and you make comments, I'm not going to put them on the screen. They're going to appear there automatically. So please keep it clean, my friends, if you're watching us live. Saad, why don't you tell us?
Don't say anything bad about us live.
We'll keep our fingers crossed.
There we go. Hi, folks. My name is Saad. I've been teaching negotiation for the last decade or so. I got interested in negotiation just through life experience. I grew up in a conflict zone, moved as a result of conflict. That prompted me early on in my years just to kind of get interested in this concept of conflict resolution, and saw really negotiation as a tool to resolve conflict. I worked in academia for a bunch of years teaching classes on negotiation. The last 5 years I've spent with corporate visions, teaching salespeople on how to negotiate more effectively in their deals. That wasn't quite 2 to 3 minutes, but that's the gist of it, Jeff.
We'll take it. You said you grew up in a conflict zone. Where was that?
I grew up in Lebanon. I lived in Lebanon until I was 11 years old. And at a certain point, my father said, all right, this thing is not working anymore. And in 99, we immigrated from Lebanon to the United States.
So, and besides moving from Lebanon to the United States, how did growing up in a conflict zone affect your life in general, and certainly your desire to learn negotiating skills?
Yeah, for me, Jeff, it was, why did this thing happen? And then as you grow up and you become a teenager, you get into high school and you get into college, you start to see this is a trend. This is happening in other places as well. And in undergrad, I really tried to kind of just try to get an understanding of it. I studied Middle Eastern affairs, political science, sociology, and that gives you sort of a theoretical overview of what's going on in the world. And then after I graduated, I said, I want to do something about this. I want a practical skill that allows me to do something about this. And that got me interested in this concept of conflict resolution, negotiation. The original vision was, let me move to New York. Let me study negotiation and conflict resolution. Maybe I can work in diplomacy, or maybe I can work at the UN or something along those lines. And then life sort of happens and I fell into teaching, and here we are.
Life sort of happened. I think I've heard that and said that before. So let's get into it. How do you actually define negotiate? What is negotiating?
Yeah. So when people think negotiation, they think all types of things. It's stressful for some people. It's anxiety provoking for others. The way I think about negotiation is an outcome-based conversation. So Jeff, in the context of sales, anytime me and my client are having an outcome-based conversation, regardless of whatever it is that outcome I am trying to achieve, that I'm negotiating. There's a tendency for salespeople to think, the negotiation happens 70% of the way or 80% of the way. And when you ask people, why do you think about it in that way? They typically say, well, that's when legal gets involved. That's when procurement gets involved. That's when the client really starts pushing back on price. When people think about it in that way, they're misdefining it altogether. People have a tendency to define negotiation as bargaining or haggling around price, but that's not it. The negotiation starts immediately in the beginning of the conversation, and you need to start negotiating in the beginning of the conversation, not necessarily on price. So you can start conditioning your client right from the beginning that, hey, these are the rules of engagement. This is how it goes. I'm going to need some things. You're going to need some things. We're both going to need to be equally committed for this thing to work.
That's a fascinating take on it. So you mentioned the term outcome or outcome based or outcome oriented conversations. What are those things? What are outcome based? Yeah.
So I'm going to shout maybe a few examples that relate to B2B sales. So maybe in your first outcome, it's just as simple as getting them to spend 30 minutes with you on a call. That's an outcome that you're trying to get them to commit to. Maybe after that, it's getting them to share information with you. Maybe after that, it's getting them to introduce you to their colleagues. Maybe after that, it's getting them to share data, getting them to sit in a demo, getting them to introduce you to procurement, getting them to agree to deal terms. Those are the kinds of outcomes that I'm thinking about.
So you're considering all of those part of the negotiation process?
Absolutely. Those are all mini negotiations. And if those are outcomes that you need, those are mini steps that you need to get you to the finish line, then you as a person, as a negotiator, as a seller, you need to be aware of what it is that you're trying to achieve at that stage. And then you need to negotiate on behalf of that thing. The reality is, Jeff, if you're not negotiating on behalf of it, if you're not deliberate, intentional about trying to drive that outcome in the conversation, it's not likely that you're going to get to what you're trying to get to.
So you mentioned a few things, and you said negotiation's not just about price. What are some of the other things that we should consider in a sales negotiation?
You mean in terms of what can you negotiate outside of price, or?
Yeah, good, because I think most people think, okay, I want to get $100,000. We only want to pay you $50,000. All right, give me $90,000. No, we'll give you $6. That's what I think most people think of negotiating.
Yeah.
Back and forth about money.
Exactly. The tendency is to focus too much on price and perhaps what I call all the other sweeteners that can come around that can give you some flexibility with the deal terms. Sometimes it's volume in certain situations. Different organizations have different levers that they can pull on. For instance, it could be, instead of a 2-year contract, we could do a 3-year contract and get more creative with price. We can give you some kind of training instead of giving you some kind of discount. We can give you some kind of expertise. We can have you at our next conference. We can introduce you to some of our customers. All things that are elegant per se, that you can concede on, that you can give to the client, and make sure you still got to package them as concessions that don't necessarily hurt your margin, or hurt your margin a lot less than just giving a straight price discount.
Yeah. So I know this is not the way most salespeople work. This is just the way I work. I don't negotiate my price. When I tell somebody what the investment is to work with me, there's no negotiation. You're either going to pay it or you're not. That's just the way I work. I'm very upfront about that. I'm not here to play games. And one of the things I often tell people, and I certainly want to acknowledge up front, I am not a master negotiator like you are. But one of the things I'll say is, look, do you really want to negotiate against me? I'm going to teach your people how to negotiate. I'm teaching how to negotiate. When I give you my number, I'm not playing games with you. I'm not trying to go high so you can go low and win. You don't really want to negotiate against me. So when I tell you my number, that's the number. Now, but here's what I do believe, and I love what you said about it. I'm happy to make a concession rather than price. So I might say, well, I can't drop the number, but I'll give you a 1-hour follow-up session via video conference. How would that work? Now, does that cost me money? It does, but you can bet it's typically, it's definitely not going to be as expensive to me as dropping my price. And I'm going to make sure I schedule that at a time when I've got nothing else planned. So it's costing me as little as possible. Does that hour cost me something? Yes, because I sell not only my intellectual property and experience, I'm selling my time, but I'd rather give that away than say, yeah, take $5,000 off, $10,000 off. And my experience has been that, because I've been selling, training, coaching, watching salespeople for 50 years, that what most people call negotiating isn't really negotiating. And I'd love your take on this. So to me,
Mhm.
it sounds like this. Hey, Saad, can you do better on the price? Oh, yeah, sure. No problem.
Yes.
To me, that's not negotiating. That's discounting, which is very different. Can you maybe talk about the differences
Yeah.
between the two?
So absolutely. And let's talk about the impression that you try to leave in negotiating in the way that you just mentioned. So, from my experience, Jeff, salespeople are too concerned about the rapport that they have with their client and too concerned about coming off flexible and I want to work with you. And when they're operating from that North Star, that's the quickest way to start conceding and conceding and conceding. On your deal terms, what works much more effectively, Jeff, is you need to influence your buyer's perception of how much negotiation room there is. So the impression that I want to leave you with, the brand that I want to have as a negotiator is I want you to take me seriously. Any outcome that I put out there, I've thought through. It's carefully calculated. I'm not just throwing any baloney up there to see what sticks. And we're not going to play this game because I want you to trust me and I want you to know that I believe and I have conviction and confidence in anything that I put out there, and I'm willing to support and justify anything that I'm willing to put out there. And if you leave that kind of impression, the other person is much more likely to take that outcome and much more likely to take you seriously. And if they're left with that impression, again, you're influencing how much negotiation room they perceive there is. If they're left with the impression that there's a lot of negotiation room, if they're a shrewd negotiator, it's their job to exploit that negotiation room. So you got to be very careful there.
Yeah. So when I actually get to the point in my process where I'm going to tell somebody how much what I've been telling them about is going to cost them, and that for me comes at the very, very end after I built up
Yes.
all kinds of value, very clearly explained what the benefits were going to be, what I was going to do for them, and all that stuff. I then say something like, now I'm sure you're interested in what the investment is going to be. So before I give you that number, and I'm going to give that to you in just a moment, I just want you to know I sharpened my pencil as sharp as I possibly could. I put on my green visor and put on that little lamp like accountants use, and I really came up with the number that's right. And I believe. Now, don't get me wrong. I still do get people after I give them the number that say, "Can you do any better?" And I usually just give them a little smile, and it doesn't take very long. And then they laugh and go, "Yeah, I heard you. Don't worry." Because I just, here's my belief, and I'm not saying this should be true for everybody. This is just what's true for me. I'm not here to play games. I'm not overpricing myself. I'm not looking to see how I can get the most money I can possibly get from you. I value my time, and I put an hourly value on my time. So I'm going to give you the number that I feel is right. If you want cheaper, go get it someplace else. There's lots and lots of sales trainers and coaches that work way cheaper than I do. By the way, there's lots that work way more expensively than I do. But I give the number right from the get-go. That's the right number for me. If it's not the right number for you, that's okay by me. It just means you're not my prospect. You're not really a good client for me. And I'm happy to walk away from somebody if I'm not right for them or they're not right for me. And I almost said, I don't understand why more salespeople don't do that. Now, I've been doing this a long time and I have the confidence. I own my own company, so I can say whatever I want. But isn't the confidence to say that a large part of an effective negotiation?
Yeah, 100%. And it leaves the other side with the impression that you're just trying to be fair and reasonable.
Yeah.
And this is it. I'm not putting something way up here. There's probably other options that exist in the market that are below, but given what I'm giving you, this is what it's worth. This is what I fundamentally believe it's worth. And that's why I'm putting it out there. I think too many salespeople, when they start to get to the negotiation part, they worked so hard to get them to that point. What I mean is when they start to get to the deal terms negotiation part, they start to get scared. They start to get anxious. They start to get stressed. I don't want to lose this. And when you get into that mentality, this is like the worst mentality to have in negotiation because you're operating from a place of anxiety of, I want to make sure things don't fall apart. We know from research when people get anxious in negotiators or when they're primed to get anxious in negotiations, what they tend to do is they become less ambitious. They become more accommodating and they reach less creative outcomes at the end of the day because they just give in too quickly.
Yeah, and I believe that prospects can smell that. My experience, just like you said, is that salespeople may do a fantastic job all the way through the sales process. And I can't tell you how many times in my career I've watched sales presentations as an observer and a coach. And when it comes to, okay, they're about to give the number, they become a different person. Suddenly they're nervous and they're hesitant. And I know I've shared this. I'm going to make it very quick because I've shared this story on this podcast before. But I was talking to two guys from Australia. offering a service that I very much was interested in. I contacted them. And when I listen to sales presentations, somebody wants to sell me something that I'm interested in, I'm listening with two sides of my brain. One is I'm listening because I'm interested in finding out how this might help me. And the other side is, well, I'm a sales coach and I'm judging everything you do. And these guys did, the right side of my brain was going, God, these guys are terrific. I really like their sales process. I'm going to compliment them. But when it came time to give me the number, they actually apologized. They actually, now look, we know this is a lot of money, but, and in my mind, I went, are you effing kidding me? So much so that I actually afterwards, I said, would you mind if I give you some unsolicited advice? Because I know most people don't want it. They said, yeah, sure. I said, you guys had me up until you talked about the price, but you came out and told me it's too expensive. Don't do that. So why do we do that? Why would we give that away?
I think too much people get so concerned about coming off reasonable. And because they're concerned about coming off reasonable, they get passive with their language and they wishy-washy and they start to couch things. And it's like, how do you know what's reasonable? Like your perception of what they perceive as reasonable, you have no idea what they perceive as reasonable. My suggestion always is, again, put your terms on, put your price on the table. You don't know how they're going to respond. You don't know if they're going to object. You don't know what they're going to object with. See how they respond and then deal with it accordingly. There's a tendency for people to over justify and over explain, and all of that just dilutes the strength of your anchor in negotiation terminology, which is fundamentally to say that they're less likely to take your ideal terms seriously. They're more likely to be anchored on their expectations rather than the expectations that you're setting.
Now, there's a technique that I've seen over and over and over that salespeople use in a negotiation. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about this. They'll give a higher price than they actually want because they expect the other person to negotiate against them. And then they hopefully end up where they wanted to be in the first place. Do you feel that's a valid technique? I personally don't use it because I don't negotiate, but is that a valid technique or not?
So the research on this is you should anchor in negotiation. You should give yourself some negotiation room, right? But as an industry, sellers have done a terrible job at training buyers to take them seriously, because what that typically means for sellers is they start up here and they concede too quickly or they concede too much. I've worked with plenty of software companies that discount 40 or 50%. And if you're in procurement sourcing those types of deals all the time, the impression that you're left with is I can always get 40 or 50%, because what they're going to do is they're always going to add a whole bunch of baloney into their first number. I'm going to come in, make an aggressive offer, let them know that I have alternatives. They're going to drop the price. And if that's my experience consistently, then I'm going to negotiate that way consistently. And I'm always going to test your resolve. The suggestion for me there, Jeff, is rather than having this much negotiation room, anchor yourself in credibility and trustworthiness and fairness, and you should have this much negotiation room. So let's go back to the example that you mentioned a little bit earlier. My first terms are fair, reasonable, calculated, thought through. If you want some kind of concession, I can work with you, but here's what we can do. Instead of a 1-year contract, let's make it a 2-year contract, and I can give you this. Or I'm going to preemptively identify the unique things that I can give to you that aren't high cost to me, but are still of value to you. And I may concede on some of those things. The wider your range is, the more you're going to have to justify, the more you're going to have to explain, the more the other side is going to be left with the impression, hold on here. This person started here and now they're all the way here. I don't really trust this person anymore. And then you're in all types of trouble then.
Yeah, and not only that, when you do that, I believe you're training your customer. So if it's a one-shot deal, it's not a big problem. But if you want a long-term customer, you're training them that if I discount now, I'm going to discount every time. And again, I've said this before on this podcast, but there's a company that I like very much that I brought into several of my clients because I love their service. And I'm not going to name them because I don't want to embarrass them. But the very first time I dealt with them on behalf of my client, the salesperson I was dealing with said, okay, here's the price, but if you do it in the next 3 days, I'll give you this. And what I said to him was, dude, I got to tell you something. You just lost the sale for today, because now I am purposely not going to buy it in the next 3 days. And I'm going to call you next week. And I know you're going to give me the same deal. In fact, I'm going to make you give me a better deal next week just because you did that. So please don't ever do that to me again. And he, no, Jeff, it's only for these 3 days. And of course, you know what happened. I spoke to him the next week and I did make him go back to his boss and give me an even better deal. And now every time I deal with that company for another client of mine, they do the exact same thing. And I tell them, stop doing this. I know that's not your price. You train your customers, don't you?
100%. You condition them to treat you in a particular way. And the reality is that you have continuing relationships with them. And then it's really difficult to untrain them. Like in down markets, there's a tendency for people to discount a lot. And then it takes really like a couple of years to unpeel those perceptions that they're left with. If they're left with the perception that every time you put out price, you're going to give me some kind of massive discount. If I push back enough, then they're going to continue to push back on that.
So you brought up, you keep leading me to the next question,
That's what a great conversation is, Jeff. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm not going to drop my price, but oh man, now I just lost the question. Son of a gun, and it was a great one. All right, when you get to my age, that's what happens. You say that sales negotiations aren't like any other negotiations, and I actually agree with that. But what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that prompted me to write the book, Jeff, is I was in academia. I learned negotiation. I taught negotiation for some time, and there's a plethora of research and science on negotiation. And then I started teaching negotiation to salespeople. And then like 2019, 2020, this thing that we call hostage negotiation just got super sexy. And there's a lot of people that started to get interested in hostage negotiation and in the negotiation field. And hostage negotiation and a sales negotiation are worlds apart. There's some similarities, but negotiating in that situation versus like negotiating with my 3-year-old daughter at home versus negotiating with my spouse versus negotiating with my boss versus, again, sales negotiation is in a world of its own. Why? How is it so different from a hostage negotiation? Why is that difference so important? A sales negotiation is nested within a sales conversation. If the sales conversation doesn't go good, the sales negotiation is not going anywhere. If they're not convinced and motivated by any of the value that you're presenting, it's not likely that you're going to be able to get them to make any kind of commitments. Given that it's nested within the sales conversation, the behaviors that you engage in a sales negotiation are different than the behaviors that you engage in a hostage negotiation. You show up to hostage negotiation, the power dynamic is different. You show up to hostage negotiation, the person is having an emotionally I don't know how to describe it, but an emotional day at the very minimum. And your job is to really bring them down to earth. Not that doesn't happen in the sales world, but in the sales world, things like active listening and empathy play a role. But things like persuasion are front and center. Things like creating urgency, things like influencing their perception of value, those things are much more front and center than any other kind of negotiation. And ultimately, one of the things that I argue in the book is that context matters. Context matters more than anything. You need to be able to read your context, and from there you cherry pick ultimately which behaviors, which frameworks are most suited for that particular context. Long-winded answer to your question, Jeff, but I hope that gives some clarity.
It does, and I love it. And to me, what the bottom line for what makes the sales negotiation different than every other negotiation is in a hostage negotiation. Of course, there's a famous book by a famous guy who was, I think, an FBI hostage negotiator. Frank, somebody, is that his name?
Chris Voss.
That's it. Okay, yeah. I forgot the name of the book, but yeah, it's a famous book and everybody talks about it. But in a hostage negotiation, you can't walk away. In a sales negotiation, both sides can walk away. Now, we don't want to. You want what I've got, and I want to give you what I've got, and I want to get paid, but you can walk away. So it's very different than like collective bargaining. And when I train people, I often use the example, and you may be too young or maybe you weren't aware, but years ago, the New York City Transit Authority, I live in New York, went on strike. There were no subways, there were no buses, and I think it was like for 2 or 3 weeks, which in New York is insane because you need the subways and buses. Well, we all knew that eventually they were coming back to work because we can't have no subways and buses forever. And in my mind, there was a bunch of fat guys in a room smoking cigars across a table. You know, we want more benefits. We're not going to give you more benefits. We want more pay. We're not going to. But eventually we knew it was coming back. In a sales negotiation, you can leave and nothing gets resolved, right?
Absolutely, right. And there's unique dynamics of those, union negotiations, the history between those two parties, the relationships between those two parties, how those two parties treat it. There's so many unique things that you need to account for before you start thinking, I could just do the same thing in this negotiation and that negotiation, it's going to take me in the right direction. I don't agree with that.
There's a great book by a friend of mine. It's called The Transparency Sale by Todd Capone. You've read it?
Yeah, I'm connected with him on LinkedIn. I see his stuff all the time. I really like Todd.
So I worked with Todd about 22 years ago. Had no idea he was this brilliant. I mean, it's what to me it's the best sales book I've read in the last 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
As is his The Transparent Sales Manager, is a great book. But in that book, he talks about transparency in sales. I'm sorry, in sales and in negotiating. He actually gives some examples which I thought were great. And I'm curious. I love the idea because what he's basically saying is, why not just tell people, here's what I want, tell me what you want, and let's see if we can come together. How do you feel about transparency in negotiating?
Mixed feelings.
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah. So transparency is great because transparency can elicit trust, and you want the other person to trust you. And that's, if they trust you, then your ability to influence them in the conversation is much higher. That's great for the sales conversation. Now, I want you to think about this scenario, Jeff. If I go into a procurement conversation and I tell the other person, look, I got about 10% that I can give you here, what's that person going to do in that conversation? Well, if you left me with the impression that there's 10%, I'm going to push for that entire 10% in the situation. Now, that's not to say that you should manipulate and you should lie and you should conceal and you should do things that undermine your reputation as a trustworthy negotiator. But it's my job to influence your perception of how much negotiation room there is. I'm not going to be completely open and honest about all the levers that I can give, because ultimately the impression that I'm trying to leave you with is the first thing that I presented is ultimately something I have conviction, confidence in, and it's what I ideally want you to agree in the first place. What I'm afraid of is if you start to not be careful enough around how you concede, that you open up a can of worms for yourself. And as a result of that, I think we talked about this already, you're going to get into some trouble, or you invite some negotiation unintentionally.
Okay. Now, when I was Never Split the Difference. Thank you, Alan. That's exactly the name of the book. When I was doing my research on you, I came across something you said, and I went, "What? Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right." Because it's what I've been teaching salespeople for years and years, and apparently I've been teaching them something wrong, which is a sales negotiation is about creating a win-win, and you're saying, nope, it's not about creating a win-win.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Saad, what do you mean by it's not about
Yeah,
creating a
right.
win-win?
So the field has really evolved over the last 30 or 40 years. And I'm just going to give you the very, very brief history. Initially, it was like, you can't go into negotiation with this win-lose mentality. Like, I'm going to beat the other person. This is a competition. You can't do that in a customer relationship. Why? They pick up on that. You're trying to beat me here. I don't want to lose. And as a result of that, it just leads to this adversarial nonsense. It doesn't go anywhere. So yes, you shouldn't have a win-lose mentality in negotiation. Oftentimes, when people go into it with the mentality of having a win-win mentality, no, there's no adversarial things there, but there's problems with this like win-win mentality. So here's what I've seen. When people go into it with the mentality of finding win-win outcomes, what they tend to do is they tend to put the relationship front and center. And as a result of putting the relationship front and center, what they tend to do is they tend to be less ambitious in what it is that they're trying to achieve. They tend to compromise and concede too quickly, and they tend to land on less creative outcomes. And we have empirical evidence that supports this. Ultimately, your job, and the other thing that I have issues with, Jeff, is like, how do you actually measure a win-win by the end of the conversation? Like, how do you really know that you've landed on a win-win? And can you really say that, yes, this is ultimately a win-win scenario that works for both people? I think in the conversation going into your negotiations, your North Star should not be finding win-win outcomes. Your North Star should ultimately be finding your most optimal outcome. Now, that doesn't mean that you trample over the other person. That doesn't mean that you need to be aggressive and adversarial, but it means that you ultimately need to figure out what is your most optimal outcome. And it means that you're willing to support that and justify that in the conversation, and then see where it goes from there. It's a different mentality altogether. What I find, Jeff, to kind of summarize this point, when people go into it with the mentality of win-win, they tend to avoid friction and tension in the negotiation, and as a result, yield lower outcomes and less creative outcomes. And when they go into it with the mentality of finding my most optimal outcome, they need to take on and introduce a healthy amount of friction, a healthy amount of tension, enough that leaves the other side with the impression that this has to be a two-way street, but not so much that it burns the relationship or it damages the connection and the rapport that we have.
And you mentioned friction, and you mentioned it a lot. Can you talk a little bit about friction and empathy in regards to negotiating?
Yeah. So this is the other thing with win-win outcomes is win-win outcomes tend to overemphasize empathy, and empathy is a critical component in negotiation, but relying strictly on empathy and trustworthiness and thinking that if this other person feels positive towards me and if this other person has rapport with me, then I'm just going to reach my most optimal outcomes. I think in some ways naive, right? Yes, empathy is important. Yes, making sure that the other person trusts you is critical, but negotiation requires that you induce some kind of friction in the conversation. Now, you don't induce friction for the sake of your ego. If you're trying to land on the most creative outcomes and if you're trying to push the boundaries of where you're going to be at in that conversation, if you're trying to create the incentive system for the other person to truly start thinking outside of the box, then you need to embrace friction. You need to balance this concept with empathy, with a healthy amount of assertiveness and a healthy amount of, hey, anything I put out there, I believe in it. I'm willing to hold the line at it for some time. And we both need to start thinking creatively here to start to make this thing work.
Mm. And what about, is there a difference between negotiating with, for example, the type of people I speak with, a vice president of sales, a president or a CEO? And there a difference between negotiating with that type of person as opposed to negotiating with a procurement officer?
Yeah. I try to be very careful not to make sort of blanket assumptions about, there's like the biggest assumption that people have about procurement is they're strictly interested in a price discount. I tell you, which oftentimes they are, right? But that's not the only thing that they care about. I did the session last year, Jeff, where um, I had half of the room was procurement people, half of the room were salespeople, and they were from the same company. So they weren't selling or buying from each other, but it was brilliant. I was so anxious about the conversation. I was like, I don't know how this is going to go. But procurement people started to say all these things that were really informative for sellers. And one of the things that I learned is that, yes, procurement people care about cost savings, but they also care quite a bit about risk. They also care quite a bit about predictability. Like, a procurement person is much more likely to get fired over signing a bad contract that exposes their organization to all this risk than they are about not securing enough of a price discount. So, yeah, all that to say is I wouldn't make blanket assumptions. I would treat each individual as an individual and figure out what their motivations are and what their priorities are, and then kind of take it from there.
Yeah, and you used a great word there, which is risk. And I'm trying to pound it into salespeople's heads that part of our job is to lower the perceived risk in doing business with us. In fact, it's to do the opposite. It's how do I make people safe? How do I make them feel safe to do business with me? Because the way brain science works is when we're making the buying decision, we automatically think of the negative first. What if it goes
Yep.
wrong? What if I hire Goldberg and sales don't go up and my boss fires me, which you mentioned? So it's
Mhm.
how do we make them feel safe and reduce that risk? I don't know if I've ever negotiated with a procurement. I've never dealt with procurement because that's just not. I only talk to decision makers. I
Mhm.
refuse. That's just the way I've run my business for 20 years. Like I
Mhm.
like sales managers as people. I don't talk to them because they can't sign checks. They can't sign contracts. That's just the way I protect my time.
Mhm.
But no matter who you're dealing with, there's always that perceived risk. What if? And if we can make people feel safe in our words and how we're coming across to them, that I believe is going to make the negotiation go better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the best choice for you. And anything ultimately that you say in the conversation that undermines their trustworthiness in you is perhaps going to get them to say, I don't know if this is the safest decisions. And that's that's to imply ultimately that you need to be conscious and careful of what you say in the sales conversation, but you also need to be conscious and careful what you do in the negotiation as well, because there are things that you can do that leave the other side with the impression that you're not trustworthy, and as a result, get them to say, "I don't know about, I don't know if this is the safest decision for us to make here."
Yeah. Um, when I am planning for these interviews, I always go to people's LinkedIn feeds, and one of the things I saw you say, which I'd like to get some clarity about, is round offers get accepted more than precise. I'm sorry, round offers get accepted more, and precise offers I'm sorry, precise ones get smaller counter offers. Okay. So what's a round offer as opposed to a precise offer?
Yeah, this is interesting research that predominantly around numbers, some implications for other things that you're negotiating as well. So think about round offers as offers that end with zero. Like it's going to be 100,000, it's going to be 500,000, it's going to be 250,000 versus precise offers is like 99,730 or that ends with a zero, but I think you see the idea that I'm going with 251,750. So it's not, ending with a bunch of zeros, or it's not ending with 10. You could go so specific and you can be like, it's $249,999.99. That's a problem. We can talk about
Like
that.
car ads. Car ads always do that. It's never $25,000. It's always $24,999. I'm like, really? Do you think I don't know that one more dollar is going to be 25,000? So yeah, please go further with that.
Yeah. So the idea there is the specific number tends to be the stronger anchor, tends to be a little bit stickier in the conversation. People with specific numbers tend to ultimately land at agreement that's closer to that specific number, because the other side is typically left with the impression that that number is calculated and that number is thought through. So let me give you like a very stereotypical example that's used in research study. Some salary negotiation, somebody starts at 100,000, the other person starts at 97,350. Although the other person started at 97,350, they land at a higher outcome because that number was more specific than 100,000. 100,000 people tend to assume that that number is just kind of thrown out there, not really thought through, not calculated. As a result, it tends to be the weaker anchor in the conversation.
But you're saying the round number, like the 100,000, that tends to get accepted more. So
Yeah.
then which is better? Do we want it accepted more, or do we want it closer to the asking price?
Yeah, so that's funny because you run into some things in the science and you're like the science and the science, and some of the science is conflicting and some of the science is sort of opposing to each other. The way I think about this is if you've reached sort of the end of the negotiation and you're almost there and you're like, this person is ready to sort of accept, I just need to get them over the finish line, then a round number may be fit for that situation. That perhaps you've conceded already, and you could say something along the lines of like, oh, look, here's where we've started, I worked with you, I've made these concessions, I'll round this off for you so we can get this over the finish line. I'm willing to do this at 25,000 for you rather than where we start. Something along those lines. I think the round number will be more effective there. If perhaps you're just starting the negotiation and you want to make sure that you leave the other side with the impression to take that number in those terms seriously, then being more specific could be perhaps more suited to make sure that the other side is left with the impression, again, that this is thought through and calculated. There really isn't much room here.
Gotcha. How important is it before we start negotiating? How important is preparation? And if preparation is important, what preparation should we be doing before we start negotiating?
Yeah, so let's broaden this conversation, Jeff, because we've been talking a lot about price. But again, we're saying that negotiation isn't just about price, it's about all types of things. Tendency for people to get anxious in negotiations, and all types of people that don't have much experience in negotiation, people that have been doing this for a very long time. And as a result, when they get anxious and stressed, they tend to throw their plan out of the window altogether. So going into a negotiation, what are some of the things that you need to plan? Ultimately, think about, all right, what's this outcome conversation about? Perhaps you're later on in your deal, or perhaps you're earlier on in your deal. You need to think, all right, what's the outcome that I'm trying to achieve in this particular moment? Perhaps I'm trying to get them to introduce me to their colleague. Preparation is fundamentally really critical, so you can figure out what is it that you're going to negotiate on behalf of first and foremost. You need to identify that preemptively before getting into the conversation. Then you need to think to yourself, Jeff, and this is a step that most people skip and it's a problem. How am I actually going to articulate that demand in the conversation? Because when people don't think about how they're going to articulate that thing, they get into the conversation and they want to be reasonable and they want to make sure that they have rapport, and then they couch their demand in all types of different ways and undermine it. So figure out what it is that you're trying to achieve, figure out how you're going to articulate that thing, and figure out how you're going to support that thing. Those are must-haves. And then from there, the other person may object, they may not object. You obviously need to empathize and hear them out and figure out what it is that they care about. But those are some things just to give people some ideas, things I think that are absolutely critical that you sort of uncover and prep for before you get into the conversation.
And one of the things I recommend, and again, you're the expert, is if you're going to negotiate price, then you've got to know in advance what's my walkaway point. And the way I
Yeah.
define that is if it's 1 penny less, I can't take the deal. I'm going to have to walk away. Am I right?
100%, right? Because if you don't have a walkaway, then your walkaway just keeps going and going and going and going, and you have multiple best and final offers, and you blow your reputation and all types of issues and problems with that. So on the price conversation, you need to know what your first offer is going to be. That's where you're going to start the conversation. I would also encourage people to figure out what is their target, meaning if I had to concede from where I started to my target, how could I do that? What is that number going to be? What are some things that I could concede on that would make sense, that wouldn't damage my reputation? And at the end of the day, I also need to figure out at what point does this deal not make any more sense for me? As you approach the conversation, and let's say you're at, 25,000 is your walkaway, and the other person says, we have budget for, or, we're not going to spend any more $15,000 on this thing. If that's the case, and that's truly the case, and there's no flexibility around it, then what's the point of continuing the conversation if you're that
There is
far?
none, absolutely none whatsoever. And that's why, for me, and I'm not saying everybody should do this, although I think most people should, in my world, excuse me, if I'm meeting with you and you're a vice president of sales in a first meeting, we're going to talk for about an hour, hour and a half, and there's going to be a lot of exchange of information. And at the end of that meeting, I already know what I'm going to be proposing. I could actually write the proposal right in front of you because I've done this long enough, and I don't do 8 million things. I could give you the price right now too. But what I do is I tend to end the meeting with, I've got to go back to my office and I got to think about everything we talked about. I got to put it on paper and I got to sharpen my pencil. But based on my experience, I think we're looking somewhere in the neighborhood of 48, 50,000, something like that. Is that about what you had in mind? And if people go, no, my standard joke is always, oh, too low. And they always laugh and go, no, too high. And, my answer is, how too high am I? And if I said 48 or 50,000, they go 10,000. There's no room there. There's no play for me between 10,000 and 50,000. If they said we were thinking 46, then that's somebody I'll invest some time in because I know I can either add enough value that they're going to come up $2,000 to $4,000, or I'll take something out of the program so that they're still getting a lot of good stuff, but I'm just not giving them the same, because I will never ever give you the same exact program for a lower amount that I'm asking. We're either going to take something out or you're going to add something in, which is money. Am I right here?
Yeah, 100%. There's a lot of strength in saying no, right? There's a lot of strength in saying, I have a boundary that I cannot cross anymore. I think one of the unique things that happens is like people are drawn to you a little bit more when you say no. People are drawn to your product and you're offering a little bit more because the perceived value of it increases a little bit. If somebody's left with the impression that, hey, they're not willing to give it away for free, this is something that they, again, have conviction and confidence in, and it's worth this much to them. So, yeah.
I love what you just said. Well, I love everything you're saying, but I love when you just said sometimes the right thing to do is say no. See, I fully expect every single person after I give them my number, I expect every one of them to say, can you do any better? I always do. I'm always going to ask. By the way, if somebody drops too much on there, when I say, can you do any better? And you drop too much, I'm going to walk away because that means to me, you were going to rip me off if I didn't ask. But when you say no, I think I'm fine with everybody asking, but my answer is, gee, I wish I could, but the number I gave you really was the real number. I don't give you a higher number, hoping you can talk me down to get, I don't play that game. So I'm sorry, I can't do that. And the other thing I say in my world is, look, I own the company. I can do whatever I want, but I'm not going to. And I think there is great power. And I don't want to waste people's time because they've heard this story a million times. But I find that most people will come back if you've built enough value and you're standing by your guns. They're going to come back. And that's the customer I want. I'm not looking for the customer who says, oh, you want 50,000. I only want to give you 30. Okay, great. I want a Lamborghini for $10 and I don't want to pay a lot of insurance on it either.
That'd be nice to have, right?
That would be lovely. Yes.
So Jeff, by the way, that's my problem with win-win, this concept of win-win, because when people go into the conversation with this mentality of win-win, they don't know enough. There's this tendency to focus too much on keeping the relationship and have an agreement and reaching a place that just works for both people. You see the distinction that I'm making there between win-win and reaching most optimal outcomes.
I do, absolutely. And I can't say this often enough, and I say it all the time. The thing that there are two things that allow me to negotiate the way I do, which is not negotiating. One is my belief in myself and what I'm providing, and that I truly do believe that the number I give is the right number because I'm going to provide at least that much value, if not more. But the other thing is, I'm just not willing to take anything else. It's like, I'm not willing to negotiate here. I know my value, pay me or don't. And it's okay if you don't, I'm fine with that. But here's the thing that really I wanted to get across. The thing that really allows me to do that is just not my confidence in myself. It's knowing I don't need the deal because I'm consistently prospecting on a daily basis. So I want to work with you, but I don't need to work with you. And that obviously in a 50-year career was not always the case. But I say part of the goal of a salesperson, whether they're beginning or middle or end of their career, they should be making sure that they can walk away from deals. And you can't do that if you need the deal too badly, unless you're the most unbelievable poker player in the world. Yes?
Yeah. Yeah. If you have nothing in your pipeline and it's the end of the quarter and you haven't met your quota, it's really hard to say no, right? Yeah, 100%. Jeff, just a side note on, I see this happening all the time. The markets that we've been in the last couple of years, right? You had 21, 22 where it was like this, and then you have uncertainty in 23, and then kind of back up. And now we're in this space where a lot of salespeople and companies are being conscious around what they spend. And what I tend to find is that when you hit this space in this landscape of uncertainty and unpredictability, and I don't know what's going to happen, people take their negotiation strategy, throw it right out the window, forget about negotiating. I got to make sure I hit my quota. I got to make sure, and I get it. I understand it. I empathize with people, but I just want people to think about what's the implication of that, and what's the damage that that's going to do to your relationship. What damage is that going to do to how this person interacts and engages with you going forward for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In this environment, which I know a lot of people are navigating, my typical recommendation is perhaps you get flexible about how you scope opportunities. Perhaps you get flexible around how you price opportunities, but don't change and don't throw away your negotiation strategy. Regardless of the market that you're in, you should be negotiating in exactly the same way. I want you to take me seriously. Anything that I put out there, I have conviction and confidence in. Because of this uncertainty in the market, don't find yourself kind of just giving the house away to get deals, because there's long-term repercussions from that.
Yeah, I'm just not willing to do that. That's just not, look, I was a recruiter for 5 years. I owned my own company for 4. And in 2001, when the bottom dropped out of the economy, I was a recruiter trying to make money. And it was very, very difficult. I stuck it out another 2 years, but the challenge was my fee at the time was 30% of the first year's income. So if I placed somebody, I got paid 30% of whatever I got for them. And recruiters immediately went down to 25, 20. I was talking to people who were saying, I can get a $500 flat fee from another recruiter. Why should I pay you 30%? Very difficult to stand strong in that, except I did. Eventually, I had to go out of business because I stuck it out another 2 years. And, it was very difficult to get people jobs when companies were laying off by the tens of thousands. But, I'm just not willing to give away money. I'd rather find something else to do. I'm kind of watching the clock, and I want to make sure we get to this before we end. One of the things I love doing is I like riding my bicycle. I enjoy the speed, and I like the exercise. And you actually use a bicycle as a tool in your book. Can you explain the guiding wheels model? I was fascinated by that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I think about negotiation.
Question, because I absolutely want to talk about that too. Well said, John.
Absolutely. Right. That comes up quite frequently, actually.
Yeah.
So the guiding wheels models, when I think about negotiation, I think there's a bunch of things that you need to do in negotiation to be effective. And I put those on a bicycle, and I say there's 3 principles on the back, 3 principles on the front. All right. You need to advocate on your behalf enough. That's the front wheel. On the back wheel is you need to advocate on behalf of the other person. You need to get them involved meaningfully in the conversation, really figure out what it is that they want. So 6 principles, 3 principles on the front wheel, 3 principles on the back wheel. On the front wheel, as a salesperson, you need to be compelling. You need to be tactful with price. You need to be careful how you concede. That's fundamentally about you. That's how you advocate on your behalf. But you need to balance all of that with the back wheel. The back wheel is 3 principles, which are you need to be trustworthy. If they don't trust you, you're going to get into all types of problems. You need to be curious. Curious is really empathizing and being inquisitive and figuring out what it is that they care about and why it is that they care about that thing. And then lastly, you need to be creative. When you balance all of those 6 principles, the bike moves forward. If any one of those principles aren't applied to the fullest extent, you're not likely to land on the most optimal outcomes.
So it's like riding your bike with a flat tire.
Exactly. The bike is just
doesn't work very
it's
well.
not going to get there. It's not going to get there as quickly. There's some problems there. We can take the metaphor longer if we choose to.
Perfect. So I'm proud to say this gentleman's a friend of mine, and he asked a question that I was going to ask. Can you negotiate over Zoom? So prior to COVID, almost all my meetings were face-to-face, because I believe nothing takes the place of a face-to-face meeting. Now, COVID did change everything, because we couldn't meet in person for a long time, and a lot of people still don't. And I certainly acknowledge, and I love the fact that there's an incredible time savings in not getting on a plane to meet with somebody, or driving an hour and a half to New Jersey, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Does negotiating in person have a different effect than a video conference? And if so, what do we need to know? Which is what John wants to know.
Yeah.
You know, how can you effectively negotiate over Zoom or video conference? And if so, what do we have to take into account there?
Yeah. So there's a research study that comes out, gets published in the Harvard Business Review, taking a look at negotiations happening over a couple of different mediums. One is, I want to say it was in person. The second one was over the phone, so you can't see the other person. And the third one is email. And they want to see what kind of impact does each medium have. They're all negotiating the same thing, all 3 groups. And what happens in that situation is the negotiations happening over email leads to the greatest number of impasses. So why?
Sense.
What's going on? Well, so much gets misinterpreted. You're not there to deal with a human face. You're not there with somebody who's smiling, who's frustrated, who's expressing emotions, and you can pick up on those things, and you can kind of go back and forth fluidly. My recommendation always, if there's a conversation where there's some friction, you're going to have to navigate. Friction in the sense that you may have to push back on the terms, or you may actually need to be inquisitive to such a degree to get this person to really open up because they've been holding back some things and you sort of sense it. If that's the case, ideally you get in person with that person. If you can't get in person, Zoom works. I haven't seen anything that contradicts Zoom is less effective than in person. But I would recommend in those situations, turn your camera on, encourage them to turn their camera on. If it's possible, you're going to get much more information. Typically, the recommendation is that when you're face-to-face with somebody, they're just going to be much more human with you. In terms of negotiation, that typically means that they're a lot less rigid. They're willing to give you just a little bit more, and sometimes that may be enough to give you a little bit more wiggle room around what it is that they want, what it is that they care about, give you a little bit more room to perhaps hold the tension and friction in a way that doesn't damage the relationship or break the rapport that you have with the other person.
But there's nothing different that we have to do in person or via Zoom?
Nothing that I've seen from research side, would just highly, highly recommend you turn on your camera at the very minimum. Yeah.
Yeah. I hate when people don't turn on their camera. It just drives me nuts.
We're facilitators, so we get it. We experience it, Jeff.
Gotcha. In sales, we ask 2 types of questions, open-ended and closed-ended questions. And I always love asking audience, which ones are the good ones? And everybody goes, open-ended. It's a trick question. They're both good. It's just we typically use more open-ended questions than closed-ended questions. But for anybody who's listening that does not know the difference, an open-ended question cannot be answered with yes or no. A closed-ended question can only be answered with yes or no. So when we're trying to close a deal, we're not going to ask an open-ended question because we're looking for a yes or no. But what do open-ended questions have to do with negotiating?
Yeah, right. So when you think about this other advocacy wheel that we were talking about, Jeff, part of that is being trustworthy. A part of that is being curious. And a large behavior that you engage in when you're trying to be curious and you're trying to empathize with the other side is really actively listening to them, summarizing some of the things that you've heard, but also asking them questions, asking them to elaborate, asking them to sort of explain their propositions, and so you can uncover sort of their underlying motivation. So there's a nice research study that comes out, gets published also in the Harvard Business Review by Allison Brooks, takes a look at the impact of question asking in conversations and what they find. This is the context is actually, it's a blind dating situation, and they're tracking strictly for the number of questions that are being asked. And what they find is the more questions that are asked, the more likely you are to get a second date with that person. So interesting, fascinating. Why is it that these persons are more likely to go on a date with that person if they ask them more questions? Well, the title of the article is something along the lines of question asking elicits liking. I may have botched the title a little bit, but when you ask questions, what that typically does, gives the other person room to sort of open up. It gives them room to explain. It gives them room to sort of vent a little bit in certain situations. It also gives them room to talk about themselves and to talk about their problems. And it turns out people enjoy talking about themselves and people enjoy talking about their problems. And that typically leads to some positive feelings and some positive emotions towards you. So an effective tool that you can use in negotiation to build rapport, but also figure out what's going on with this other person. There's a tendency for people to shy away from asking follow-up questions. Those are particularly impactful in negotiations. Why is it that you want this, or why is this so critical for you? Tell me a little bit more about that. What are you really trying to achieve here? What's really driving this? So sort of follow-up questions we know from research tend to be super impactful because they allow you to really uncover the bottom of what's really driving their propositions and what they're lobbying on behalf of.
Yeah, Dale Carnegie said it's better to be interested than interesting. And when you're asking the questions like, I'm just curious, why is that important to you? A, it shows that you're interested in them. It proves you're likable. And B, you might actually find out what's the driving motivator, and you might be able to help them with that. What is the other the person we're negotiating? I hate the word against with. What's their level of happiness after a negotiation? Tell us.
Yeah.
I found this fascinating when I was reading.
Yeah, this was a fascinating article, and I've seen it all the time. It's like research study and negotiation happens, and then afterwards they tell the other person that you're negotiating with, they're part of the research study, we want you to express happiness. Or they tell the other person, we want you to express frustration. Or they tell the other person, we want you to express sadness. Or we want you to express these emotions. And they want to see if somebody walks away from the negotiation really happy, how does that influence you as a negotiator versus somebody walks away from the negotiation feeling really sad? How does that influence you as a negotiation? And what we find is that when the other person sort of expresses happiness, we're like, hold on here, what happened? Why are they so happy that I do as well as I could have in the negotiation, right? Or when the person walks away sad, you're like, oh, they're frustrated, but they agreed, or they're feeling sad, they agreed. I must have done pretty well in the negotiation. The takeaway there for me, Jeff, is like people judge their success in negotiation on all types of arbitrary things. If this person is happy, I must have done not good. If this person is sad, I must have done pretty good. And you got to ignore all those contextual cues. The way in which you judge your success in negotiation is by going back to the thing that we talked about a little bit earlier, is by preparing, figuring out what it is that you're trying to achieve. And then by the end of the conversation saying, here's where I landed. How good did I do in this conversation? There's all types of things that happen on the other side that can throw you off, that derail you, that could focus on what it is that you're trying to achieve. How did I do in relation to that goal? And then you judge your success from there. And then you iterate accordingly in future interactions and go from there.
It's really about how I feel after the negotiation, not the other person. But I mean, I don't want to walk out of the car dealership and see my car salesman high-fiving his manager with a big smile on their face. Yeah, we got that guy.
Not so good. Not a good feeling in that situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Damn, we've only got time for one more. I could talk to you all day, man. How about this one? How does the order in which we present options impact a negotiation?
Yeah, so this happens quite a bit, especially if you have, I can do it in this way or I can do it in that way. But I typically recommend salespeople also like using ranges. Use options better than ranges. Options, ranges, like it can be anywhere between 25 to 50,000. Options are like, option 1 is for 25,000. It includes this. Option 2 includes this. Option 3, it includes this. Options work better because they influence what is included with that particular option, whereas ranges could leave the other side with the impression that it could be anywhere between that range, could lead you to some trouble. If you're presenting 2 to 3 options, what we typically recommend, research supports this as well, smaller range of options, the option that you favor the most goes first. So if I'm presenting 2 options, I want you to agree to the first one. That's my preference. That is my most ideal option. That's the option that I'm going to present first and foremost. And typically in sales context, I don't recommend you present more than 3 options. Honestly, preferably 2 options at most. Start presenting too many options, they start to get confused. It starts to become very difficult for them to make a decision.
And am I right? And we really have to end this, but am I right that if you're negotiating a bunch of terms and money also, terms first, money last?
Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
If we're negotiating all kinds of things, I want to negotiate price last. I want everything else out of the way. Then I'm not going to do it, but that's my advice. Negotiate price last so that we get everything else out of the way. Is that just something I picked up that's a fallacy?
I'm thinking about whether you should deal with the more difficult or less difficult issues first, and what sequence that makes is what I'm thinking about. And what I've seen on that is, what I've seen on that is, I don't know if the sequence matters so much if it's two. I'm thinking about this as scientifically as I possibly can. I'm thinking about opening up the pie so you can see if there's trade-offs that you can make across terms and price, and dealing with all of them sort of simultaneously. Because sometimes there's your, if I'm willing to do something on volume or contract or whatever else. Yeah. I don't know if that's the best answer to that, but that's the only thing that comes to mind for me, Jeff. Yeah.
We'll take it, sir. Well, I agree with my friend John Hill, who said this is a great session. I enjoyed Saad very much. Saad, before we go, can you tell people how they can reach you? The name of the book, by the way, is In the Lead, Mastering Your Sales Negotiation. Where can we get the book? How can people reach you if they're interested in a negotiation seminar or any of the services that you offer?
Jeff, truly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for having me on. You can find the book on Amazon. It's called In the Lead, as Jeff mentioned. If you search In the Lead, Saad, it'll come up. I'm also on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is linkedin.com/Saad, Saad. So just an A between my first and last name. That's all.
Or reach out to me and I'll point you to where Saad is. Saad, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your brilliance so generously. And I will end as I always do. First of all, if you're listening to us here in America, this is Memorial Day weekend. Please enjoy the 3-day holiday if you've got Monday off. I live a block from the ocean, so I'm hoping that the sun actually comes out because it's been raining the last two days. But remember this, guys, sales is a game of making things happen. Get out there and make sales happen. Have a great weekend and holiday, everybody. Have a great weekend and holiday, Saad. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jeff. Take care. Bye-bye.